Welcome back, everybody, to conversation number 95. 5 more to go before conversation number 100. I guess we'll have a party. But before we start, we want to thank our sponsors as always. Let's start by thanking Conductrix, who've been with us from the very beginning. Thank you, Matt, Nate, Ezekiel, Ashley, and the entire team at Conductrix so much for supporting the TLC. We'd also like to thank our newsletter sponsors, starting with Conductrix, and Growthbook, AB Smartly, and SiteSpec. Thank you all for providing your thought leadership to the community. Last but far from least, thank you to Convert for sponsoring the Conversations. The Conversations channel over on the TLC is a place where you can ask and answer questions, get to know each other, and actually you're competing for monetary benefits that Convert is helping to encourage folks to get to know each other. The April conversation competition just wrapped up, and we'll be getting ready to launch in May. But go check out the conversations, engage, get to know each other. It's a great way to engage in the community. And Blazing Growth, thank you for supporting Eddie Aguilar. Thank you for supporting the TLC and the community. Next up, a few, I guess I forgot. I just get to announce Tim because I don't have any other announcements this week. So if you've been in the analytics or experimentation space for any length of time, you probably know Tim. Or better luck, or even better, you've had the chance to learn from him. He's the head of solutions at Facts and Feelings, a business consultancy with a mission to help organizations put their data to productive use, which also happens to be the subtitle of, his best selling new book. And I think it's best selling because of its footnotes, which I asked permission, and Tim said I could read a few of them out loud because they're my favorite part of the book. I mean, the book itself is really amazing, but I literally how many of these did I tweet them, or did I blue sky them, or whatever you call them? I don't know. I really enjoyed these footnotes, and I think you all should read the book just for the footnotes and the content, whatever. But just to give you an example, here's a couple. We won't get into the scientific philosophy behind it in this book, or exactly the sort of, that's a statement for which the null hypothesis cannot be rejected, which is exactly the sort of arcane language we would need to employ to expand on this further. You can thank our editors for sparing you that side trip. That's one. If you find yourself muttering "preach on" under your breath, or even shouting it out loud, well, that's a little odd if you're literally doing that. If, though, you're reading this footnote and thinking, well, yeah, I kind of had that sort of thought, then an analytical angel just got its wings.
That's the one that I was going to use that I told you that I dropped out. That's chapter 6, page 98. That's like the only footnote that I could reference specifically. Wow. Okay.
It's good. And last, we now regret having purchased the omniscient cap from that shady-looking fellow on the path into town. Clearly, we should have bought the magic beans he was offering instead. Read this book, y'all. You'll love it. It will bring joy to your heart. You'll learn a lot, and you'll laugh along the way. So, you already know Tim. I don't really need to say anything else, but one thing I will say is that what makes Tim truly special isn't just his depth of knowledge, his amazing book. It's the way he brings clarity to complexity. I've had the honor of working with Tim for nearly 6 years in the past, and those conversations, whether they were about sample size estimation, conversion rates, or just how weird analytics can be, made me a better experimenter and a better teacher. He has the unique ability to take a concept you think you understand, show you all the ways that you don't, and then build it back up with such a precision and insight that you walk away not just smarter, but inspired. He calls himself a cranky curmudgeon, but don't let him fool you. He's one of the kindest, sharpest, and most thoughtful humans I know, and we're lucky to learn from him. Please join me in welcoming Tim Wilson.
Ooh.
Take it away, my friend.
It's a little bit like right back at you. I think I only sort of understand binomial distributions now because you had to teach me how to understand them. So All right. So, thank you and thanks for coming. I was kind of scanning and like half of the people here I know and half I don't. So, uh, we'll see which ones drop early partway through this because they just can't take it. So, I've given kind of versions of this. This is kind of a slightly longer version than I've given to date on this. It's kind of weird because I'm not explicitly pushing the book. Obviously, would love for people to buy the book, share about the book. Uh, I obviously wrote it because I thought it would be useful. Um, but it's also like a 200-page book, and I'm doing a 45 minutes talking about it. And I kind of want to hit some of the highlight points that we've gotten feedback on, or that like seems kind of the most distinct or useful or interesting, which means that it's inherently got some kind of jump cuts. And I am not an eloquent enough speaker to necessarily tie those directly together. They will be obvious. I'll probably call them out as well. So I'm going to cover a series of different topics that they go together in a long form prose. They may seem a little herky jerky, which I'm not proud of, but it's the best I could do. So this is a book that is co-written by myself and Dr. Joe Sutherland. So I sort of frame that as I am coming from an analytics background, came up through architecture, technical writing, marketing communications, digital analytics, and kind of learned along the way with some formal analytical training sprinkled in as part of that. Joe kind of came from much more of an academic background, PhD from Columbia. He worked in the Obama White House. He is the founding director of the Center for AI Learning at Emory University. So I kind of refer to him as the data scientist. He does not refer to himself as a data scientist at this point. Kind of feels like the label has gotten so diluted that it's actually kind of lost some of the meaning. But he comes from a very can kind of hang with anybody who's doing any form of data science and understand what they're doing. What we found when we started working together about 6 years ago is though even we were coming from very different backgrounds, we were both kind of philosophically very, very aligned. And we both thought it was kind of a lack of understanding on our part that why we were seeing businesses and organizations do things that didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. From spending a couple of years working together and then more time kind of talking about it, we're like, no, we think we're onto something from these two different backgrounds. And that's really where the book came from. The book is, as Kelly mentioned, it's got illustrations in it. This is the illustrator, um, Paul Lyron. He also happens to be my brother-in-law. This is a picture taken, give or take, like 3 days from when I first asked him back in 2017 if he would ever have interest in illustrating a book that I wrote. So I'd been thinking about a book for a long time. The book that we actually wrote has some structural similarities, but also is deeper and richer than what I was envisioning back at the time. So came through, and Paul and I are still on very, very good terms. So that's seemed a little risky to be collaborating with my brother-in-law, but didn't seem too risky, and it worked out well. He actually has an illustration that didn't make in the book that he really liked. It just didn't wind up fitting, and we made it a refrigerator magnet for him. So it is on his refrigerator in New York. So I mean, so we came through okay. So it is a book kind of, it says in the subtitle that it's for business leaders. And why business leaders? And business leaders means kind of business managers. It's targeting business people because it's the business that is getting told you need to be data driven or data informed or evidence driven. And from what we were seeing was that a lot of times the challenges were not actual data or technical challenges. The challenges that we saw organizations running into being ineffective or inefficient with how they were putting data to use was much more kind of in the lack of sort of clarity and framing and definition of what they were actually trying to do. So we absolutely think the book is useful and valuable for analysts and data scientists and CROs and researchers, but it is geared towards business people and kind of helping them kind of get more clarity about what they're asking of the data, what they're expecting of the data. We're not unique in that. I mean, going back to, competing on analytics, Tom Davenport, there are lots of books that have kind of attempted that, and we're making an attempt at it as well. So one thing that we think is really important to get through, and we hit it pretty early on, is that there are these misconceptions that have just grown over time about kind of what data can do, what we're supposed to be doing with data. And we need to overcome those misconceptions. So hitting them, the ones that we outlined kind of fairly quickly. One is this idea that if we just get all the data, then we'll eliminate uncertainty. And when you put most of these misconceptions in front of somebody in stark terms, they'll say, well, yeah, I don't really think that. But if we look at the organization's behaviors and how much they've, to use a Mac Gershoff-ism, how they've fetishized the collection of data. They just act as though that's the goal. We just have to get all the data so that we can just get to this unambiguous truth. And the reality is all we can do, all data will ever do, all experimentation will ever do is reduce uncertainty. So we are making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. There's a cost to reduce that uncertainty using data, and we can never eliminate it. So we kind of posit that we sort of wish there was kind of a constant reminder of that, because a lot of times it is easy for technology platforms and frankly, a lot of analytics people to pretend as though, oh, if we just get the complete data set, if we just have a 360-degree view of the customer, then we will know everything and we will be able to provide absolutely definitive paths forward. And that's just not the case. Another misconception that's kind of related is that in order for the data to really be as useful as possible, it has to be complete. And the challenge with that is that anytime we look at a set of data, we can always spot holes and imperfections in it. And those are tangible things that if we say that if we had infinite time and infinite resources, we would want to fill those goals. But we don't have infinite time and infinite resources. But still, organizations chase plugging all of those holes. They're acting as though we're marching towards this place where we will have gathered all the data. And then we'll be there. We'll be done. Yay. And everyone will sit around and kind of sing kumbaya. The reality is that if we look outside of marketing and outside of product, there are decades of experiences and looking in like the social sciences and econometrics and politics and even healthcare, where wildly like small and incomplete data sets can still be very useful. So there are methods and mechanisms for using incomplete data. And if we just kind of obsess about being completionists, then we just all we do is chase more and more data. We actually don't find ourselves using the data. This is actually a big thing that I learned from working with Joe, how often I was sometimes saying, well, but this data it's the data set's too small. And he'd say, stop thinking that way. There are methods and techniques. We can work with what we have. It may not be as good as if it was more complete, but that doesn't mean it's not useful for making decisions. Another one is misconception that the data is kind of objective and it gives sort of an objective and unbiased truth. This one actually has two pieces to it. On the one hand, I think it's been pretty well talked about, not solved or addressed, but certainly as machine vision and AI stuff has come on, there's been a lot of like pretty horrible examples of if you feed biased data in to train a model, you're going to get a model that acts in a biased way. So underrepresented communities are some of the most kind of burned, the most public examples that get talked about that. So yes, there's that kind of bias. There's another type of bias or lack of objectivity that I think is broader and more consistent. And I kind of point to this particular Deming quote as being kind of the culprit, or at least a representative culprit. And analysts and even some business people kind of like to use this particular quote as kind of a cudgel. So this is no shade on Deming. There are lots of other great quotes, and Deming did a lot to bring statistical process control into business and did a lot to kind of get organizations using data more effectively. But this particular quote sets up this kind of binary. Either you have data, hard data, or you're just somebody with an opinion, or you're God and you're not God. So therefore, you don't even fit in this. All that matters is the data. And that's really problematic. Like we have to recognize the value of human instinct and human experience and human creativity, which are all come across as ideas, which are opinions. And so the hippo, we used to really like to denigrate the highest paid person's opinion. Over the last few years, a few people have said, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't just be like scoffing at the hippo. Like they may be the highest paid person because they had some smart ideas. We shouldn't just kind of discard people's opinions. We should be bringing those together. To use data effectively, we have to start with ideas and then use the data to see if those ideas hold up in many, many cases. So it kills me when I see analysts kind of proudly put this um, uh, quote up. I saw it on a LinkedIn, somebody's banner once. Luckily, I think for me, I've forgotten who it was, but I remembered the emotional reaction that I had to it. I was like, that's an analyst who's an asshole. I bet that people don't like working with them because they want to go around and say, I have the data. I am this, I'm putting me on the same pedestal as God. So very, very frustrating. The last misconception is around self-service analytics and data democratization, which absolutely we should be enabling access to the data by everyone in the business, appropriate access to the data they should have access to. The challenge is when that gets treated as though that is the destination. And I will throw some shade at BI platforms and analytics platforms that hold that up as saying that's in their sales demo. If you can just get all the data in the hands of your business users, then they will be able to generate their own insights. And what happens instead is that the business partners often say, great, now I'm just overloaded with data. And where do I start? The number of times that I would have a account manager come to me and say, hey, we've gotten all this data loaded in for this client, but now they're asking us what to do with it. Can you come look at their dashboards and tell them how to get insights from them? That meant we were already we dug a hole because we'd set an expectation that just opening up the floodgates to all the data was somehow going to make an organization data driven. And it just didn't. So those are sort of a set of misconceptions that if we can get organizations, and this is the analytics team, the experimentation teams, and their business partners kind of not behaving as though they believe these misconceptions, we would be in much, much better shape. So here's one of those jump cuts. Let's talk about causal inference. So this is another, to me, very profound concept. When I started working with Joe, he kept talking about causal inference. And as I've gotten to know other kind of like pure data science type peoples, they're like, it's causal inference, causal inference. And I was like, what are you talking about? That's just kind of fancy words. Um, and Joe and I were both going to a conference up in Boston. We were going to meet up there. And I was like, hey, before I show up, can you send me something that I can kind of read up on this causal inference thing you're talking about? He sent me a couple of papers. That one of them talked about the potential outcomes framework. You can't talk about potential outcomes without talking about counterfactuals. My mind was kind of blown, and I have not been able to let it go. I talk about it any chance that I get. And what I found is when I talk about it to others, maybe not everyone, but there will be somebody coming back to me in a few weeks saying, I can't stop thinking about counterfactuals. And it's a really, really useful construct to help individuals understand when they're making decisions to kind of embrace the uncertainty, understand what's really, really going on. So I kind of pushed pretty heavy to say this needs to be, I believe needs to be within in the book, because I think it's a really, really useful framing that we would, when people are making decisions, to kind of think about that they're definitionally making a decision. They're creating a reality, but they're also creating counterfactuals. And the questions that they may be asking now and in the future are very much related to counterfactuals. We try to kind of explain those a few different ways. The one example I'll walk through, and it's fictitious and it's a little silly because it's overly simplistic, but it's relatable to a business context. Say we have an organization that for whatever reason, data or no data, gut instinct, the executives have decided that in order to be successful, maximize their success, they are going to do an across the board price cut on all of their SKUs of 10%. They're going to do it on June 1st. And they've made the decision, and that's what they go ahead with. And then we're 7 months later and looking at the actual results. So the y-axis doesn't really matter. A bigger number is better. Revenue, profit, let's say it's profit. But we look at these actual results, and the question is, did they make the right decision? So overly simplifying things, we're pretending that the only choice was to uh, keep prices the same or drop them all 10%. And we look at this, and maybe at the first glance, you're like, well, it looks like things went up a little bit. So maybe that was the right call. But then this is a sophisticated group. We know we can't really do that. And we say we can't really say, was that the right choice or not? Because we don't have the information shown here to make that declaration. The way to kind of precisely measure whether this was the right call and to quantify whether it was the right or wrong call and by how much is it's a simple formula. All we have to do is go and measure what would have happened if we'd kept the prices the same. That's our counterfactual. And that's kind of the kicker. We can't measure the counterfactual. If we knew definitively what the world would have looked like if we had not made that price cut change, then we could just measure the difference and we could say, yes, clearly this was the right decision. And we can quantify exactly kind of the area between those lines is the financial impact of that change. Doesn't mean that the counterfactual might have been if we could measure, split the universe, it might have been that things would have been better if we'd kept the numbers the same, in which case this was not the best decision, and we could quantify the loss that occurred because that decision was made. We can't directly measure the counterfactuals. We can get kind of close in one specific scenario, but for the most part, when we're rolling something out, we can't definitively say whether this exactly what the impact was, even though because businesses are thinking we have all this data, can't you give me a specific answer? So what are we doing? Even when we run a test, or if we use a Bayesian structural time series, or if we use a REMA, or we use a diff and diff, there are lots of different techniques. What we're doing is we are trying to estimate the counterfactual. And that means when we make these estimations with all the different techniques, there's kind of built in what's our level of uncertainty? How wide is the range of possible results if we had followed the other path? So representing it here as though it was kind of like simulations, which is another technique that could be used. If we looked at this and said our estimated counterfactuals could have been higher, could have been lower, then we would look at this and say, we don't really know. We can't really make any statements as to whether this was the right or the wrong choice to have made. But it certainly could have been a case where whatever technique we used would say there's still uncertainty in what the counterfactuals were, but the way we ran this, that uncertainty for the most part, our actual results are kind of above that. In which case we can still say, yeah, it looks like this was the right call. Things did work out better than if we had not dropped the prices. But we're also showing that we can't tell you exactly how much because we don't know exactly what the counterfactual was. All we have is a range. So this thinking about counterfactuals also kind of implicitly starts to force people, not in a mean way, but it helps them think about uncertainty. Oh, I'm asking a question, which means I'm really trying to imagine what would have happened in another world or what would happen in a different scenario. And that's not perfectly knowable unless I'm actually omniscient. So it can be really kind of useful. So this is the same thing as if we're showing two distributions and trying to explain kind of test results, but it's looking at it in kind of a different way. And I found it to be kind of useful. So jump cut number 2, the core of the book is what are the different ways that we can actually put data to use, that organizations can put data to use. And this is kind of the meat of the material. It's kind of the chapters 4 through 10, I think, cover this. So we're going to skip lots of components that are actually get much, much more into the details than this. But it's sort of the setup, like what are those 3 ways that we can an organization can put data to use? One is just measuring performance in a meaningful way, answering the question objectively and concisely, how did we do, in a way that is actually useful. Another is trying to make a decision about what we should do, kind of forward looking. I'm trying to make a decision. How can I inform that decision? And how can data support helping me make that decision with a little bit more confidence or a little less uncertainty? Those are both kind of decision-making functions of data. One is performance measurement. What do I need to focus on? Where are things not going as I expected? Hypothesis validation is what specifically should I do? A decision about what I should do next. The third way that data gets put to use is actually where it's just required. The process requires that we use data. If I order a pair of shoes from dsw.com, there is data that I have to turn over and they then have to use in their process. Which shoes, what size, what color, how did I pay for them, where do I want them shipped, what shipping method do I want? That is all data that is just part of the process. Now, that data may get used also for validating hypotheses or measuring performance, but that data's existence and the most fundamental way that it's adding value is because that's how the business actually runs. It's core to a process. So lead nurturing, CRM process, call center processes. We have processes all over the place. So I would make a case that when we talk about AI, that AI applications overwhelmingly fall into operational enablement. It doesn't mean that AI can't be used to support the process of hypothesis validation and the processes of measuring performance, but AI doesn't really do those functions or it doesn't cover the very, very, very human required aspects of those. All of these are related. Or they can be, they can influence each other. If I'm measuring performance well and I see something is not going well, then I want to know what should I do about it? Well, that is throwing me over into the point of validating hypotheses. What action should I take? And I've got lots of choices of what I could do for corrective action. Let me treat those as hypotheses, try to validate the ones that seem most promising, give me a new way forward, make a change. That feeds back into performance measurement. I took an action, did actually see the recovery that I was expecting. When it comes to operational processes, if we are creating a new process or changing a process, adding AI to a process, that's because someone thinks that there is value in doing that. And if someone has that idea is a hypothesis. So treating updates to a process or the creation of new processes as hypotheses can be really, really valuable. That's kind of at the core of what like an MVP is, certainly. Although sometimes organizations roll out MVPs, but they don't treat that as a hypothesis validation. They just say, let's roll it out and see if we can make it work. It's like deeply emblazoned in my brain, and there are at least a couple of people on this call who will likely know which B2B to C company we were working with that rolled out a very expensive kind of lead nurturing process on the B2B side that they could have validated that it was going to be a stinker with like some simple math early on. But they got so excited about the idea and rolling it out, by the time they rolled it out and started trying to measure its performance, things were really messy because it was a dog, yet couldn't really stop because they'd already sunk cost fallacy. It continued to run. But that's the last part where this all ties together. If we've got a process rolled out, we should be ensuring that that process is delivering the value that's expected of it. So you're not necessarily doing this for every process, but for key business processes, how are we measuring the performance that is delivering the outcomes that we expect based on the upfront investment and the ongoing cost to keep that process running? So that's a lot, but that's kind of the setup for the core of what we cover in the book. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into just the performance measurement, and I'll touch on one part of hypothesis validation as well, because these are, I think, kind of some of the most useful and maybe a little bit different from how a lot of organizations work. So we said performance measurement is just how did we do? If we put a little bit of a finer point on it, performance measurement is objectively and quantitatively and concisely measuring where are we today relative to where we expected to be today at some point in the past, right? How did we do is fundamentally answering that question. Are we getting the results that we expected? And organizations really struggle with this, and it's understandable why they struggle with it. But the way that I, for years now, have talked about helping organizations, the business side of organizations, think about this and do this well is to think about performance measurement as being fundamentally reliant on building a time machine, which is a little corny, but it works. And hopefully this will make sense as I give my little spiel on that. So now I'm using a campaign as an example. This is performance measurement is not limited to campaign. It can be any project, any initiative. It can be a product feature. It can be a website, an app. It can be a department. So just for the sake of simplicity, everything I'm going to say applies to anything where we're doing something and we're expecting results. So, taking a campaign example, we have a campaign, we're planning it, we launch the campaign. At some point, the campaign is running, or maybe it's done running, and someone says, how did it do? And it's like, well, this campaign was supposed to drive leads. So we pull a number and hey, we generated 1,500 leads. So now the question is, how did we do? Uh, is that good? And that question as an analyst throughout my career, like delivering the results and saying, congratulations, you've gotten 1,500 leads. Or you asked me to pull the results, you got 1,500 leads. And the question that gets asked is, wait, is that good? And usually experienced analysts will have like a sinking feeling when they've delivered results and somebody asks that question because they know that they need to ask a question that might not have a simple answer. And the question is just, well, what did we expect? Because if we expected 2,000 leads, then this is falling a little bit short. If we expected 500 leads at this point, then this kind of blew it out of the water. But the only way we can answer that is that good question is if we know what did we actually expect. So what we want to do when somebody says is that good is we want to be able to hop into a time machine and travel back to the planning phase and say, what did we back in time? What did we set as those expectations? But that means we had to have asked the question, what results, what business outcomes do we expect to achieve back during the planning? And that question gets dodged all the time. And the reason is because there's not an immediate need for an answer. When someone is asking the question of what does success look like, there's no pressing need to answer that right now. It only needs to be answered now so that in the future, we have kind of an objective set of expectations to compare against. So I've used almost this exact same diagram many times with marketers. And often I will say, have you experienced this? Have you had a case where you ran a campaign or rolled something out and you saw the results and then didn't know if it was good or not? And the hands usually went up. Or I've done this as kind of a little cartoon, silly scenario, and then even run surveys with marketers and said, do you relate to this experience of asking that question of, is that good? And no one has an answer. And so it's a feeling that analysts have felt, marketers have felt, and this is an attempt to say, because this is what's going on. But that means we have to have the diligence up front to really set those expectations. The wonderful thing is that if we set those expectations, it actually can drive some really healthy alignment around what actually gets executed for the project. So the way that I have for years now run that part of the process, the planning, is instead of just asking what are your KPIs, if you just ask what are your KPIs, you wind up just getting a bunch of metrics thrown back at you, and that's not actually that useful. So instead, asking the question, hey, we're about to embark on an investment of time and resources and money on something. What is it we're trying to achieve for the business? What would we tell an executive in the elevator why we're doing this thing? Doesn't have to have any data or metrics involved in it, but why fundamentally are we really clear on why we're actually rolling this out? And then once we've answered that question, we ask the second question, which is, how will we know if we've done that? And the operative word is the that. We don't want what's all the data we're going to look at, what are all the metrics we care about. We just want to know, how will we know if we've achieved that thing that we're setting out to achieve? Because a lot of times we don't have direct measures of that. We're trying to increase awareness or drive consideration or improve the customer's experience. Well, how are we going to agree as a team that we have achieved that? We have to basically set KPIs. So that second question is really asking, what are the KPIs? But it's not using the KPI language necessarily. When it comes to a KPI, every KPI, there are sort of two characteristics. It has to be a metric that has a definition, and there has to be a target for it. KPIs can't be like, oh, it's revenue is the KPI. It can't just be leads, because we've shown that if we had 1,500 leads, did we achieve what we were trying to achieve? We don't know unless we know how many leads we agreed that we were expecting to achieve. So trying to just pick KPIs as just metrics and not have targets, it's kind of like trying to play a game of darts without having a dartboard. It would be kind of a weird game. We're just kind of throwing stuff at the wall, which would be just like providing a dashboard that has, here's a bunch of metrics, but we don't have any comparison as to whether that was good or not. What happens is that people start saying, well, how do we rationalize that we hit a target? What's the benchmark? What's the over year comparison? After the fact, sort of trying to rationalize, well, this is why it seems like this number is good. Or if they really have it out for somebody, this is why we think that number is bad. It's just not useful. So um, the problem, so I didn't entirely use images from within the book because considering the audience, when asking someone in the business to set a target, this is the typical reaction. I have absolutely wish I had kept a tally of how many times I have used this picture and its companion, which we'll get to in a minute. I will probably retire still using it, but because it encapsulates what I think goes on in the brains of many, many business people when we say, cool, we know what you're trying to achieve, and we have agreed on what metrics we're going to use for that. What are the targets for those? And there's kind of this seize up sort of, it's not fight or flight, it's flight. Get me out of the conference room, get me off this Zoom. We've never done something like this before, so how could we possibly know? We don't have any benchmarks for this metric. How could we possibly know? You're asking me to pick a number for the future that if I miss it, I'm afraid that it's going to look bad on me and it's going to impact my career. So there's lots of kind of immediate reactions to sort of seize up and flee from that and say, I can't do it. But the reality is we have to do it. It's not that hard. It's actually kind of fun, and it can really drive some healthy, useful discussion within a team. So in the book, I go through 3 different techniques. Everybody loves to kind of talk about technique number 2, which is this bracketing technique. It's actually in practice gets used less. It makes a really good point, but I'm only going to talk through kind of the first technique because it is far and away, it's the easiest. It is the most effective. It's the most impactful. It's not that hard. The other 2 techniques are kind of fallbacks if you can't get this technique to work. Now, I should say there may be cases, depending on the organization and the specifics nature of the project or initiative, somebody may have developed a forecast, or there may be some model that says this is what the target needs to be. Putting that aside, because that's this tiny little percentage, the other 95% of the time, when it's, hey, we're doing this thing, what should our target be? And the backs of some napkins, it's also kind of got a second name, which is a mini wisdom of the crowds. It's really effective. And the more I've used it, the more it just keeps working and working and working. And the way it works, it is kind of cheekily referencing the wisdom of the crowds. If you're familiar with James Surowiecki's book from years ago, that he went and looked at a bunch of different studies and just had found, like, this has been proven time and time again, that if you get a diverse group of independently deciding individuals, they will collectively make a better estimate or a better prediction than if you just get a single expert. So examples are like guessing the number of, green jelly beans in a jar, or the weight of a steer, or the outcome of an election. There are lots of cases where consistently this is proven out. We don't have hundreds or thousands of people to survey to ask what a target should be, but this mini wisdom of the crowds is kind of related. And this is the key is if it's a small group, they're still independently deciding individuals, that they will collectively align on their expectations for results better than if we just said, find me a benchmark, or just ask the analyst, or have one person just come up with a number, which is technique number 3. So how does this work? Like, it's literally what it says. The key is that we're trying to avoid anchoring bias. So I've done this with as little as 2 people regularly. I'm at a small company. So Val Kroll and I have done this with 2 people many times. It can be 5. It can be more than 5. The key is to say we're all aligned on the answer to the first question. What are we trying to achieve? We've all aligned on a metric that we're using to determine how we know if we've done that. And then for each one of those metrics that are how are we going to know if we've done that, we say, what do you think the target should be? Don't spend a lot of time on it. And most people will say, I don't know. They'll do the Kelly kind of freak out face. But you're kind of get past that by saying, we're all going to do this. So we're not, no one's kind of on the hook to totally figure this out. We are all in the same boat. So we get a little bit of collective, relief. This is on no one person's shoulders. And now everybody just has to think quickly, like, what is the rationale they would use? Time and again, if there are four people and you have a metric and four people all say we have no idea and they all do the exercise, three of them will somehow magically come up with a target that's pretty close to each other. And then there will be one that's kind of a total outlier. And it's not like you just average them, you don't throw out the outlier. Everybody has now, because they've gone through that exercise, they've thought about some rationalization and they want to talk about their rationalization. So it just prompts this discussion about why do we think this is an effective target. Very, very quickly can then get to agreement on what an effective target would be. We just did this last week. We had four different answers to that first question and 3 to 5 metrics for each one of them. So we wound up having like 16 of these we had to go through. We did it asynchronously with a half dozen people by sending them a survey ahead of time, so they could fill it out without seeing each other's work. And then we shared back. We basically put the napkin down for everyone and had a discussion. And we got through all of those. We had a 90-minute meeting scheduled and we finished like 10 minutes early. And it was super effective. And everyone was checked in because everyone wanted to sort of weigh in with their thoughts and hear other people's thoughts. And it gets everyone aligned. What are our expectations, which then sets them up for that down the road measurement. This can be done very easily with Zoom or Google Meet or Teams. We do this a lot as well. Let's not go off and do a bunch of research and come back, depending on the metric and the people on the call. We say, okay, we've decided on this metric. Let's everybody just spend a few seconds thinking what they think a reasonable target should be. On the count of three, we'll throw it in the chat and people get into it. Once they've done it like once, they're like, oh, I get this. It's not that terrifying. It prompted a good discussion. Now I'm on board. Let's do it again. And then you're kind of off. You've like pivoted the way of working and everyone's on board and they see the value. And that moves from this kind of, I can't do it to I can do it. So, love that picture. So, so that's performance measurement, kind of diving into sort of some of my favorite aspects of that. We'll shift a little bit to hypothesis validation. This is a big topic. There's a lot of how do you tease out ideas, turn them into hypotheses? How do you keep them in a hypothesis library? How do you prioritize them? I'm not going to go through any of that. The one thing that I think for the TLC specifically, if we have kind of a CRO or a focus, I think the CRO world, experimentation is very good about saying we don't want to run a test if we don't have a hypothesis established. So that's great. The downside is that there's the risk that you start saying, oh, if you have a hypothesis, then you need to run a test. So what we posit is that any idea can be converted to a hypothesis, and there are multiple ways to validate a hypothesis. It's just the strength of the evidence that we have doing that validation can vary. So if you are making a low stakes or need to make a very, very quick decision and you don't have time to run a test, you maybe either have to use weak evidence or that may be the most appropriate thing. So it's about trade-offs. We know we don't want to run a full-on controlled experiment for everything. We have to recognize that there are trade-offs. The silly, kind of fun example I like to use that if somebody is trying to convince you to jump out of a plane without a parachute, I mean, if somebody's trying to convince me to jump out of a plane with a parachute, I'm already have made many, many wrong decisions in my life. But when it comes to jumping out without a parachute, I'd say, well, why would that be okay? And if the jump guide says, look, here's a study, and there is one that says there's evidence that people have survived when their chutes have not opened. That has happened. There was kind of a tongue-in-cheek study that was done that was actually based on real evidence. And I was like, wait a minute, that's not strong enough evidence. If you just show me evidence that I could survive, that's not enough evidence. I'm going to need much, much stronger evidence for something that is this high stakes in order for me to not kind of go with my default behavior of wearing a parachute. So the ladder of evidence is just very simply, we're not the first ones to call something a ladder of evidence. There are sort of various versions out there. So we've unfortunately kind of added another version of the ladder of evidence to the body, the corpus of ladders of evidence out there. But it's very simple. And that is you get stronger evidence the higher you go on the ladder. And there are kind of three types of evidence: anecdotal evidence or anecdotes. We're in this habit of like dismissing anecdotes and saying, that's just an anecdote. But that seems like a little bit of a miss. If I have a choice between having no evidence or anecdotal evidence, generally I'm probably going to want to go with the anecdotal evidence is some evidence. It's weak evidence. I should be aware that it's weak evidence, but it's not evidence that has no value. There can be value in talking to 5 customers to validate an idea. Maybe only 2 of them come in with a strong agreement with the idea, but the other 3 don't horribly disagree with it. So you say, you know what, that's enough evidence for me to move forward. If I get a secondary research, somebody's done a deep survey or study, and then I get it and I say, I think this applies to this hypothesis. That's still anecdotal evidence because I didn't actually conduct the study. So we need to not. Um, um, oh, I'm watching Kelly having all sorts of fun in this Measure Slack with my uh, shirt updates. But anecdotal evidence has value, but it's weak evidence. Descriptive evidence is where, coming from an analytics background, it's kind of where I've lived the most of my professional career. And that's where organizations, some of those misconceptions above, we have petabytes of data, millions of rows, thousands of columns. Can't we answer every question with descriptive evidence? The kicker with descriptive evidence is that at its best, it is still correlative. It is never causal. Causal inference techniques applied to descriptive evidence are kind of the causation is relying heavily on the theory in the person who's building the model. It's not really going to give you that direct causal evidence to validate a hypothesis that relies on causation. There are lots of pitfalls with descriptive evidence. So there's confounding bias. There is, if you're working with time series data that's non-stationary, it's very easy to have things that have a 0.9 R squared that is completely misleading. So descriptive evidence, there is use in working with somebody who's a statistician or has some deep statistical knowledge, or at the core be aware of some of the pitfalls. Descriptive evidence generally stronger than anecdotal evidence, but still has some pitfalls and gaps in it and is not as strong as scientific evidence. Scientific evidence is controlled experimentation. That's the world of the TLC experimentation, A/B testing, field experiments, match market testing. All of those fall into scientific. That is the closest we can get to actually observing the counterfactual, to tie back to the language we hit earlier in the presentation, because we're basically trying to use pretty solid, robust samples of 2 different realities in which we can compare them. But there's still uncertainty baked into those. But there's a cost with scientific evidence because we have to go collect more data. Definitionally, that is data that we don't yet have. We have to design an experiment, conduct the experiment, and analyze the results. But that is also the strongest evidence. Any given hypothesis, there may be one or multiple ways to validate it across this ladder, and thinking through what are the stakes, what do I really need to know, how strong is the evidence that is warranted based on the risk involved in the decisions that I'm making. So with that, just to map to the book, we hit some stuff from chapter 2, we hit chapter 3, chapters 4 and 11. We hit some pieces of chapter 5. Chapter 5 was the first chapter that was written when we were actually pitching the book. That was in the book proposal, pretty substantially as it came out in the final, although it was chapter 4 at the time. Chapter 7 was this ladder of evidence. Obviously, we're missing 8, 9, 10 have no representation, although 10 has this one cartoon that I particularly liked. Chapter 10 is where we go into operational enablement, which is where we hit on AI, human in the loop, on the loop, out of the loop, that sort of stuff. And with that, I left 6 minutes for questions, comments, or thoughts from the peanut gallery. Kelly was just up to shenanigans in the
What I
Slack
do.
channel there.
Ben, you want to ask it? Do you want me to ask for you?
I can ask as the leading peanut in the gallery. Um,
Well,
hey, so the expectations are usually set off of a premise, sometimes that are completely wrong, whether that's a study that was falsified or whatever. When maybe, and this is why I'm asking, I'm probably doing the wrong way. I'm asking them, throwing them not shade on that analysis necessarily, but trying to widen that uncertainty that they have in their expectation, and usually get the response, well, that's why we hired you guys, because you're the experts, or that's why we're doing this. So you tell us. And then they remove themselves from the conversation. So have you had any good tactics or methodology that kind of opens that door to
Yeah,
building off of it?
Ben, a shout out to Recast with just trying to put a bunch of content out there that in some ways, if you look at it, is actually trying to educate the masses and not overpromise, which I think there are plenty of technology companies that do the exact opposite and promise, like they set up the,
any object syndromes.
that you'll be, yeah, you'll eliminate uncertainty rather than reducing it. I've found that like clever's not the right word, like educational kind of visualization using analogies. I am going to pull now like the example because I wind up explaining Bayesian structural time series, which I don't fully understand, but I had enough. I was like walking with scissors and trying to show someone that, oh, you're doing a pre-post analysis. We're putting fancy stuff on top of this, but let's logically talk through what we're doing. Of course, we cannot tell you exactly what's going on, right? I mean, so like walking them along, so there is kind of a relationship and a communication and a storytelling and a, you know, don't be an asshole and the way that you're like not getting overly pedantic. Like it is like a soft skill. Um, but so like
Not being an
showing them.
asshole is a
Uh,
soft skill.
yeah, at some point I'll if somebody has any tips on how to run with that skill. Uh, I haven't made a client cry in 15 months. Good for me.
You have it
Uh,
on the wall? Like,
so, but I think like even, or I'll use the example, like putting like people understand like error bars. So let's never show the results of a test with these are the two
yes,
conversion rates. Put the interval around it, and just to and then like that injects like this is what we observed, but the reality is, so so I think there's
you don't know.
in data visualization, there are ways of finding some example that's straight from their lives. Like, of course, there is uncertainty. Why do you think this is different?
Because people understand the plus or minus in polls because media.
Yeah,
So report that when you report results.
yeah. Um, so I'm often looking for not making it overly complicated, but showing bands, showing that it doesn't necessarily help if you're like they're saying we're going to go with your media mix modeling platform and you're going to give us the answer because they will still want to just grab coefficients and say this is the number, um, and that's yeah, it's tough. I mean, it's a reason that that's so early in the in the book because I want the business world to think about that more clearly.
Erwin, I'm going to read your question out loud for the recording. For counterfactuals, are people inclined to find counterfactuals that make their recommendations look better?
Oh, that's a line that I meant to have in I if they say they're looking for like we start seeing counterfactuals everywhere, I will claim that a big challenge with the current political landscape is that everyone, both sides of the aisle, like to declare counterfactuals with a degree of certainty that they just don't have. So I think that it is important to say, here's how we are going to estimate the counterfactual. But you really want to do that ahead of time. Here's how we're going to estimate the counterfactual. If you start doing it after the fact, then um, it can become a gaming the system. Keep trying different ways to find a counterfactual as opposed to defining up front, never more objective about like what we might achieve than before we set out to achieve it. But even having that discussion of saying, what do you think would happen if we don't make that change? And sort of forcing them to think oh, is this thing going to really dramatically change things? Or you're right, we're kind of playing at the margin, so it's a pretty small impact that we expect it to have. Just having them think about that helps think about how drastic of an impact they're expecting realistically to see.
Awesome. We're at time. I want to tell everybody really quick because there's placeholders that I haven't actually put in there, but they're going to go in there today. Till is going to be on the TLC May 9th. Then we have the TLC Mentorship Summit coming at June 4th in Experimentation Elite. June 5th, of course, is Experimentation Elite in Birmingham. So I hope everybody will be there. And then we have putting the customer first with why is that not showing up? That should be there. But Sam Burge is going to be here, and that's May 30th. So hopefully everybody will be there. So we've got Till and Sam Burge are the next two talks on the TLC. So those should be showing up really soon on the website. See you all. Tim, amazing as always. You won yourself a lifetime of free hugs for those pictures showing up. Someday I'm going to rip them out of all of your future presentations so I never see them again. But love you as always, my friend. Thank you,
Thanks.
everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Bye.